Okay, this chapter is similar to the last chapter in which we dealt with cost control and standard control. Now we're talking about revenue control, and this is almost very similar to the last chapter. You need to set an appropriate revenue standard. You have basically cost standards and sales standards. You need revenue standards. They must be determined. And just like using a budget and forecasting for cost, you need a budget and forecasting to check your actual revenue and compare it to the revenue standard. If you should be making $100,000 in profit and you're only making $70,000 in profit, your variance in what you projected is $30,000. And at the bottom it says, hey, take corrective action if necessary. So we'll cover that in this chapter right now. And this talks a lot about manual guest check systems. Now remember, the person handling most of your money, most of your credit cards, are the front of the house people. And there's a lot of responsibility in place in that. And a lot of times the cooks and chefs, they don't handle money. But the people serving your guests, they're handling the money. The bartenders, the waiters or waitresses, the cashiers or hostesses. So we talk about a manual guest check system. A lot of times use a duplicate check. You have one copy goes to the guest and the other one goes to the kitchen. And really simple. End of the night, the manager compares the two copies. And if there's any discrepancies that arise, then the manager takes care of it to see, was the error on the kitchen, was the error on the waiter or waitress, or maybe the error was on the actual guest. But as we know, the guest or the customer is never wrong. Now let's talk about the control procedures for manual guest check systems. Guest checks should be specifically printed and hard to duplicate. Once again, we talk about pilferage, thievery, quote unquote, stealing. You don't want someone bringing in their own guest checks and all of a sudden they write them out, give them to a guest, and they pocket the money. Unused checks should be stored in a secure place, and along with that, guest checks should be sequentially numbered and logged out to servers. Usually they give like a set of checks. Let's say it starts at 004, and they give all the way up to 021. So they have these 18 or 17 checks, and at the end of the night they need to return them back. And if any checks are missing, I'm going to find out, like, what happened to check number 012. Was it a void? Was it lost? Was it a duplicate check? Was it a return meal? And these are things you have to determine. So once again, you don't want money walking out the door, and you want everything accounted for. Now, as of course technology is involved again, we have the automated guest check systems, and most restaurants use these, most hotels use these as well. A lot of times they pre-print hard copy, serially numbered guest checks, once again sequential, it's very similar to manual guest checks. Before a waiter or waitress or server enters an order, usually the server they input their identification numbers. Therefore, they're responsible for that guest check. That's important. So it's easy to track. And as the orders are relayed to the production areas, in other words, the cook area, the same items, they're printed on the server's guest check. So it's a check and balance system. The back of the house knows what's going on, the front of the house knows what's going on, and the customer knows what's going on. All the information should be the same. Now, there's two different ways to pay a bill. Well, there's actually more than that, but let's break it down to two that the textbook utilizes. The two main systems are basically called the server banker system and the cashier banker system. Under the server banking system, servers and bartenders, they collect the money and they keep it until they check out at the end of their shifts. So in other words, if the shift starts at 4 o'clock and then the shift ends at 10 or 11 o'clock at night, they keep track of everything. And then at the end of the night, basically they check out everything and record the receipts. They check everything and match it with what the manager has, and they pay money back to the bank, back to the restaurant, and whatever's left over are their tips. Basically the tips that belong to the server or the bartender. Now the cashier banking system, which is one that I'm more comfortable with from a safety standpoint, guests pay either the cashier directly or employees who collect the money basically turn over to the cashier. So therefore, the cashier is responsible for everything. So if you have 7 or 8 servers, 2 or 3 bartenders, the cashier is the focal point. They say, okay, I'm going to cash you out. So therefore, the report comes from one source. That seems to make things just a little bit easier. Now, sometimes things get crazy. You have to kind of wait in line a couple times. There's only one cashier. But once again, if you have one focal point to find out where the issues can be, a lot of times that's easier to discover any problems. Now, I'm just going to kind of repeat myself a little bit to reiterate some facts, reiterate some observations. Features of the server banker system. Servers use their own banks. In other words, you may give a server $100 to start out so they can distribute change. They may have their own private POS system that can take credit card transactions right at the table. and they retain that revenue until it's time to check out at the end of their shift. And as I said in the previous slide, at the end of the shift, the manager tallies all the guest checks assigned to each server in the presence of that server. And that part's key. Both people need to be looking at what's going on because, once again, not all managers are actually ethical. So it's a check and balance system. Now your POS technology, point of sale, and the server banking system. POS technology, I don't want to say it makes it idiot-proof. I shouldn't say that. But it makes the closing procedures and tracking much easier. It's all automated. Usually has some examples, the table number of covers. There's a 4, 5, 6, 7 people at the table. The elapsed time from opening to closing of the transaction. That can be a little bit deceptive. Sometimes you can actually close a transaction. They may not ring it out until 5 or 10 minutes later. Sometimes different people join the table at different times. So all of a sudden you enter a meal and 3 other people join. That elongates the meal. So just kind of take that for what it's worth. Talks about the total, the food and beverage revenue, how much is on the check. It figures out the tax. Sometimes we can't do 6% in our head. And the tips due to the server. Okay, you're getting 20 bucks off of this. That's what the credit card said. It makes it easier. And of course, the old data analysis. I love that term, analysis. Basically, we need to read the data. It's one thing to have information, but we need to do something with it. When you look at everything at the end of the night or end of the week or end of the month or whatnot, you have to measure your sales performance of individual menu items by product category. How well are we serving the meatloaf? How well are we serving the soup? How well are we serving the hamburgers? Are we selling enough of them? You can track individual item sales, and I've said this in previous chapters. Analyze product acceptance. What does that mean? How popular is an item? We talked about dogs and stars and plow horses and things like that. That's where we get the information from. And sometimes you can monitor advertising and sales efforts. A lot of the chain restaurants will say, okay, we're selling this, we're selling the barbecue burger, or even McDonald's, they're big on this. The Shamrock Shake. They offer that obviously at St. Patrick's Day, and they're going to analyze it. Okay, we're going to advertise in this market. How well is it going to sell? And then we talk about daily server productivity reports. Revenue reports include daily productivity reports for each server. It shows how many guests they serve. So if they have 4 tables and they're 4 tops, they can never really have more than 16 guests at a time. They find out the total revenue. And so a lot of times you can track, how well are they suggestively selling items? Are they upselling? Are they selling an extra soda, an extra beer? Red Robin's big on this, and I see that from a customer standpoint as a restaurant consulting standpoint. When I go in there as a customer, I always check to see, okay, are they trying to sell me an extra beer? Are they trying to sell me dessert? Sometimes I'll get a dessert just to reward them. Hey, you know something? They went through the effort. I'm going to do it. And a lot of times they track the average revenue per guest. This is a very deceptive tool right here, and I'm going to go a little bit into this. Sometimes what waiters and waitresses will do, because they're being monitored, maybe 4 people will sit at a table and 2 people are kids, and they know in the back of their head, you know something, these kids aren't going to order anything. It's going to lower my average revenue per guest. So they'll mark down 3 as covers as opposed to 4. So if their entire bill is 30 bucks, they're making $10 per guest. If they only have 4 people on there and the average bill is 30 bucks, then it's much less. It's like $7.50 per guest. So you got to be careful about that. That's why we have to kind of walk around just to make sure we know that everything's being ethical. Now, why beverage control is difficult. Now, most of this, which I talked about in the previous slides, deals with food control. And I'm going to read part of this verbatim. The result is that employee theft of revenue is much easier and does not necessarily require collusion between 2 or more employees. In other words, a bartender can kind of do this on their own if they're good. And I probably shouldn't use the word good. If they're effective, I'll say deceptively effective. That's the best term to use. You have some factors that are involved. And once again, it's not always unethical. In a manual bartending system, in other words, free pour, it's very hard to track the actual number of drinks served in any type of operation. Same for myself. I have a couple signature drinks that I make. Sometimes they have 3 or 4 different ingredients in them. Sometimes somebody has a heavy gin and tonic. Sometimes it's a light one. I have a manual system. Many components of an effective beverage revenue control systems are time-consuming for staff members. And that's a key concept to understand. Managers simply don't have time to go up to a bartender, go to the bar, maybe 7, 8, or 9 o'clock at night, and do a spot check. Especially if it's busy. You wouldn't have time for that, and it takes away the ambiance. The last thing you want to do is to interrupt the bartender's mojo, because they have to build a rapport with their clients and their customers. And if a customer sees a manager kind of checking up on the bartender, it kind of ruins the theme, kind of ruins the mood. So it's a tough call there. And many operations charge different selling prices for different beverages at different times. The infamous happy hour, cocktail hour. Sometimes there's higher prices when you have a band playing. I know where I work, sometimes I'll run happy hour up until 10 o'clock. I just name it differently for legal reasons. Sometimes I'll run a Moscow Mule for $5, and I'll make a joke saying, hey, we're trying to get international relations going and have a Moscow Mule. I'll offer an Italian Surfer, which is one of my signature drinks. Hey, let's have better relations with the euro. And I may take $2 off. But in the system, it shows I'm selling 20 of these drinks, but a lot less. And maybe after 10 o'clock, I charge a different price. So once again, there's a lot of factors involved when we talk about revenue control in the bar and beverage area. And just kind of backtracking on the last chapter combined with this chapter, it's up to you on what you want to do, what type of effort you want to put forth for analyzing the variances in some of the revenue. You can either accept it, hey, that's part of business, I may not be making the ideal profit margin off of everything, or go all in and say, okay, I got to stick to my standards, I want to make the right profit every time. Once again, that's your call and depends on what business you work for.